Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this joint WFO and Westwood Global Energy Group webinar. I'm David Linden, the head of energy transition at Westwood, and I'll be acting as, I guess, your host for today. Today's webinar follows the launch of WFO's H1 2023 Global Offshore Wind Report, to which Westwood contributed. And so today we're providing you really an update on the status of the sector and how things, or how we are seeing things evolve over the coming years. I mean, this is an industry that can deliver multi-gigawatt renewable energy with billions of dollars of investments and jobs and other economic benefits. While this year in particular, what we've seen is that there have been a series of headwinds that, at least the industry hopes has reached their peak. So really now it's about trying to reflect, focus on what matters, trying to understand how the industry will get through this kind of period, and then getting back to delivery. And to help make that happen, to help us make a sense of what's happened, excuse me, and what we expect to see next, we've gathered, I guess, a group of experts, both from WFO and from Westwood. Specifically, we've got on the left-hand side here, Gunnar Herzig, who's the managing director and co-founder of WFO. There's myself, and then there's Peter Lloyd-Williams, a senior analyst from Westwood, and Bahzard Ayoub, a senior analyst in the Westwood Group as well, both focused on offshore wind. They're here for you, so please. You can pop them in the chat, in the Q&A, excuse me. And we will get to those certainly at the end, but also if it's relevant to what we're talking about at the time, while we are running. Just before we do get started, let me just give you a brief overview of Westwood if you're not familiar. We're essentially a specialist market intelligence provider with offices in Houston, Aberdeen, London, and Singapore. Our heritage very much sits in the offshore energy sector. With that comes, a good 15 plus years or so of offshore wind experience. So really at the very early stages of the offshore wind industry, where we were advising governments in terms of, well, what could this sector even be? If we then look at the next page, what we've got there is essentially an overview of our WindLogix market intelligence tool. So taking those sort of 15 plus years of experience, a couple of years ago, we decided to take that and put that into a market intelligence solution that you can subscribe to. Really, the idea behind it is to provide a comprehensive solution, sort of covering projects, the supply chain, and the commercial side of the industry. On that solution as well. But we are here to listen to our expert, to Gunnar, to get us going. Gunnar, lovely to have you on the call. Over to you.
Perfect. Great. Thank you very much, David. And thanks for the kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me well. So yeah, my name is Gunnar Herzig. I'm the Managing Director of the World Forum Offshore Wind, or short WFO. And it's my great pleasure to be talking to you today about our latest Global Offshore Wind Report for the first half year of 2023. Great. So if we go to the next slide, just to tell you a few things about WFO, we are a global business platform promoting offshore wind worldwide. And by now we have more than 120 global members from all parts of the supply chain, from Europe, Asia Pacific, and North America. And we have a decentral organizational approach with offices in Hamburg, Tokyo, Taipei, and New York. And yeah, we are very excited to have this new knowledge partnership in place now with our good friends at Westwood. And we're very thankful for their contributions to this latest edition of our Global Offshore Wind Report, which we really feel makes the report even more exciting, interesting, and insightful. And if we now jump into the report, you can actually find the full report on our website, and then you can check out everything in detail. And as you might know, the report is being updated every 6 months. We have the half-year update and then the full-year update coming out in January usually. And going forward, Westwood will always kind of kindly provide input to our reports, so they should be as exciting as this one. And therefore, let's jump into the numbers if we go to the next slide. Great. So let's start with the capacity that was added over the first 6 months of this year. So the operational capacity that went online from January to June of this year. And in total, that was 5.6 gigawatts. And that is actually a bit of a slowdown compared to last year, because during the first half of last year, it was close to 7 gigawatts, 6.8 to be exact, that were added over the first 6 months. So we already see a bit of a slowdown in the build out of the industry. In terms of the average size of a newly added offshore wind farm, we can see that we are increasing sizes a bit. So the average size for the first 6 months of this year was 374 megawatts, which is significantly more than what we had during the same period last year, which was 205 megawatts. And what we actually see by now is a very wide range of projects that go online. We already have gigantic gigawatt scale projects, but we also have comparatively small projects, especially when we're talking about floating offshore wind projects. They are still smaller scale projects. And therefore, on average, we're now at this kind of 300-400 megawatt range. But we have this really wide spread of projects that we're seeing online. And in total, 15 projects were added over the first 6 months of this year, 10 of which were added in Asia, mainly China actually, and 5 in Europe. If we then go to the next slide, we can see the total capacity that is currently in operation. And here we're now at slightly above 63 gigawatts of operational capacity worldwide. And in total, that is 272 individual offshore wind farms, again, of which the lion's share is in Asia, 150 offshore wind farms in Asia, 120 in Europe, and only 2 in the US at this point in time. But as we will see in a moment, that will hopefully be many more in the US over the next couple of years. And as you might know, the early growth of offshore wind back in 2014, 15, 16 happened mainly in Europe, in the core markets, especially UK, Denmark, Germany. But the recent growth, especially 2021, 22, and this year, is mainly happening in China. But China, of course, very much of a standalone market, which is quite isolated and doesn't have too many connections to the outside world in terms of developers or suppliers, therefore very much of a special market. If we now have a look at the country breakdown in terms of capacity for every individual country, we can again see that China is the strongest market by far, with nearly 30 gigawatts of capacity in operation. We then have the UK in second place with pretty much half of China's capacity, almost 15 megawatts. And with that, it's the biggest market by far in Europe. We then have Germany with slightly above 8 gigawatts of capacity. And then we have 3 mid-range markets with more than 2 gigawatts in operation: the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium. And then we see a number of emerging markets like Taiwan, Vietnam, France, or Japan with below 1 gigawatt of capacity in operation. But as we will see in a moment, soon they will enter this mid-range segment where they will cross the 1 gigawatt threshold of capacity in operation. Exactly. And as we see on the next slide, when it comes to capacity under construction at the end of the first half year of this year, we can see that China is again in the lead with 2.4 gigawatts of capacity under construction, but very closely followed by Taiwan, which has almost exactly the same capacity currently under construction. And since Taiwan, is a much smaller market that is very significant for Taiwan, we then have the UK with also an impressive 1.65 gigawatts under construction. And that's composed of two big construction projects, the gigantic gigawatt scale Dogger Bank A project with 1.2 gigawatts of capacity, and then the Naht-Nagoith, apologies for my pronunciation, project with almost 500 megawatts. So also a significant project. And those kind of are currently under construction in the UK. We then also see France and, interestingly, the US with now two big projects under construction. So finally, we see large-scale projects under offshore construction in the US, which will really get the US going. And then we also have some more European markets with significant capacity under construction, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. And then also Japan kind of kicking things off and getting ready for more and more offshore wind capacity over the next couple of years. And if you want to check out projects in detail, please do have a look at the report, and you can find all the individual projects that went into operation during the first half year and that are currently under construction with some additional details in the report. And then you can get an exact view of what is currently in operation and under construction in which parts of the world. So with that, it's my pleasure to let you know that that you'll be able to hear more about the latest global developments of the offshore wind industry at our upcoming WFO Global Summit, which will happen on January 31st and February 1st in Barcelona, Spain. And if you're interested to join this 2-day conference and exhibition with international guests and speakers, please do check out the website where you can find all the speakers and the agenda. And it will be a great pleasure to see many of you in person in Barcelona early next year. So that was it from my side for now. Thank you very much for listening, and very happy to answer any questions you might have at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Gunnar, for taking us through that. My name is Peter Lloyd-Williams, and I'm one of the senior commercial analysts here at Westwood Global Energy. And what I will do in this part of this session is essentially take you through some of the key themes that are dominating the offshore wind industry, provide some context and background. And then in the second half of the presentation, my colleague Bahzard Ayoub will come on, and he'll talk more about our supply chain and capacity forecasts. So if we get going, we can see that I pulled out 6 key themes here for the offshore wind industry, some of which are interrelated, and I think most of which will be familiar to those of you watching in some ways. So those are cost inflation, project delays, disappointing auctions, local content, continued government ambition, and energy security. And I think put together, they paint something of a confusing picture. If we think about what we've been seeing for the last 9 or 10 months or so, we've seen sort of record-setting German lease rounds with huge numbers being produced. At the same time, we've seen auctions in the US gone, lease auctions that have been quite uneventful. We've seen the negative news about projects getting delayed and inflation pushing things back. But at the same time, we've seen organizations like the EU talking about raising renewable targets, as they did with the passage of the Renewable Energy Directive third update a couple of days ago, and talking more about energy security stipulations and how they want more of these additional criteria to be used in the consideration and giving out of state support and state leases for offshore wind. So it's a bit of a confusing picture in terms of different forces pulling in different directions. And what I'm going to do now is essentially go through some of those in perhaps a little bit more detail. So the first thing that I want to look at is this question of whether support levels have fallen too far. That is government support levels generally in the form of revenue or offtake support. And the big sort of data point in this case is AR5 in the UK, which took place a few weeks ago. That's the fifth CFD auction for offshore wind and also for other renewables. And the big headline for us as offshore wind players was essentially that no offshore wind capacity bid into the auction or was awarded capacity, and this is the first time that ever happened. So we essentially had 4.5 gigawatts or so of projects which could have participated, but none of them chose to. So what was going on here? And I think it was a case of a number of factors coming together. Essentially, the simple question was that the amount of money that the government put on the table was too low. So £44 was the sort of maximum bid price in 2012 levels, which works out to about £60 in today's prices. And essentially there was a general feeling from industry that this just wasn't high enough. And so we sort of had a mismatch here between developers saying, we don't think we can do this, while at the same time policymakers saying, essentially, we're going to continue with business as usual. We want to put on similar strike prices to what we've seen before. So I think there's a bit of a wake-up call for the industry and a bit of a sort of a message being sent in terms of it being clear that there was this big gap between sort of the business as usual approach that governments have been taking up until now, and also the sort of the current price situation. Talking about price, that brings us on to cost inflation, which has really been sort of the bête noire of the offshore wind industry for the past 12 months or so. We, Westwood Global Energy, did quite a lot of work on this, particularly in the first half of the year. We did some work on our offshore wind cost inflation survey, and that's some of the results there that I'm showing you. We found people essentially saying that they'd seen sort of modal cost increases within their businesses of 11 to 20% since 2021. A slightly greater number saying that they'd seen more than 20% compared to saying that they'd seen less than 11%. So pretty chunky rises in terms of the prices that we've seen. And we calculated that on the trajectory as it stood then, that would probably add about $280 billion to the cost of offshore EPCI over the next 10 years. And I think what we've been seeing a lot through 2H of this year is really sort of the impacts of those cost inflation factors coming out to play. So as we can see on the next slide, there's been a number of delays and cancellations announced. And essentially what this slide does is track the publicly reported projects delays and cancellations that we've seen in terms of cumulative gigawatts and EPCI capacity delayed. So we're counting as of now about 12.5 gigawatts of capacity has been either delayed or cancelled, and that works out to about $35 billion of EPCI capex, and that's just including clear public announcements. So we'll probably have seen some internal non-public delays as well, which won't be featured in this graph. I think as you can see from the graph here, the US has been the most hard hit, which you might expect with it being a bit more of an immature and a bit more of an expensive jurisdiction. But we've also seen the impacts in Europe, obviously, Norfolk, Boreas and Vattenfall in the past couple of months. A little bit less clarity on what's happening in Asia, perhaps because some of these projects are slightly less advanced, less public stage, but I think we'll be seeing similar things going on. And just sort of in terms of the general trend of what's happening here, I think it does seem to be that we're seeing more sort of the more ambitious projects, maybe sort of your Trollvind style projects in Norway, or your projects in more expensive jurisdictions like the US start to be affected first. And those were some of the first that were pushed back. So it'll be very interesting to see whether this contagion continues and we start to see delays and cancellations of what we might regard as more conventional, more established projects in sort of more safe, conventional, established markets, whether there's sort of a wider contagion of the delay issue resulting from cost inflation. I'm just going to bring out some specific examples now. So this is the case of 4 projects in New York. That's Empire Wind phases 1 and 2, Beacon Wind and Sunrise Wind, which together amount to about 4.2 gigawatts of capacity and $11 billion of capex. What we've essentially seen here is offtake agreements that were put in place with the New York authorities between 2019 and 2021. Some of these projects haven't been worked on since about the 2013 times in terms of when the releases were originally acquired. And now essentially what the developers are saying is we can't afford to realize these projects at the levels that we agreed them. So they've come back to the New York authorities and essentially said, we think that we need this increase in our offtake price in order to be able to bring these projects to completion. And as you can see, there's quite chunky increases there as well. I think between 27 and 66%, so quite significant, which puts the New York authorities in a bit of a difficult position. What do you do? Do you accept an increase in prices, which obviously you're not going to be inclined to do, having made an agreement before at a lower level? Or do you sort of see the possibility of the developers cancelling contracts and maybe then just bidding the contracts later at higher prices than you get now? Or do you run the risk of the capacity not getting delivered at all of which is particularly difficult when you've got state rules, when offshore wind targets and things like that. So a combination of forces there. And the next case study is one that you might be familiar with as well. It's the Norfolk Boreas project in the UK, where the developer Vattenfall announced earlier this year that it wouldn't be proceeding with development because of cost increases. Well, this one is particularly interesting because although the project's been planned since about 2010, the CFD, so sort of the offtake price for the electricity, was only awarded in July 2022, and for it then to become through and sort of be cancelled a year later is, I think, a quite stark indication of the extent of the impacts of cost inflation within the industry. The fact that it only took essentially a gap of 12 months for a project that Vattenfall thought would be viable at this particular level to essentially be pushed to the side as costs rise, but obviously that revenue in place that they'd agreed stays the same. So I think all of this sort of hints at the questions the governments face in getting the balance right when it comes to setting policy for offshore wind. And they're sort of being pushed in two directions. You maybe got the more traditional side, where you've got to think about, we want to bring more capacity online, we want to bring cheap power to consumers, and we want to scale up the industry because we know that will bring costs down. And you've also got perhaps the newer criteria that have become more in focus in the past couple of years, thinking about, well, we want things like sustainability, biodiversity to feature highly in developer plans. We want grids to become more sophisticated, and we want developers to think about how they can integrate projects into the grid in a particularly sophisticated way, maybe thinking about storage or potential hydrogen production. And also questions about things like supply chain integrity, which is a particularly big one in Europe at the moment. Do we want the projects delivered at the lowest cost, or do we want them delivered in a way that supports the local supply chain? And that can obviously have different connotations depending on what jurisdiction you're in. So in the US, that might involve building some more of a supply chain, whereas in the EU, it may involve supporting some of the existing major suppliers against potential competition from internationals, particularly in China. So we've seen a sort of a move towards the latter, the non-price criteria, in recent months, but obviously with the recent price pressures we've been seeing, we've also got the pressure on the issue of achieving the alternative or the traditional goals. So different auctions in different countries have prioritized different setups so far. There's really no consensus that has been reached as of yet. It'll be very interesting to see going forward just how things shake out in this manner. And that's all from me at this point. I think I can now hand over to my colleague Bahzard, who will be able to bring us through the industry outlook side of the presentation. Over to you, Baz.
Thank you, Peter. So I guess despite the challenges and themes that have been mentioned by Peter, the industry does remain cautiously enthusiastic about investing, and there's still a strong pipeline of projects that are expected to come online by 2030. We at Westwood have reduced our, forecast to 2030 by about 22 gigawatts since 1Q of this year. Now, some of this has been attributed to us revising our floating wind capacity forecast, which I will be talking about in the later slide. But also some revisions have occurred due to project cancellations, and also us, I guess, pushing back estimated online dates for newer markets such as Brazil and India to the post-2030s, as they still haven't sort of fully established policies, or the auctions haven't fully started yet in some of these countries. Now, looking at capacity additions, 333.2 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity is forecast to be operational globally by the end of the decade. On a country level, mainland China is forecast to have the highest amount, with over 123 gigawatts worth of offshore wind farms. The UK is forecast as the second highest amount with just over 48.4 gigawatts, and Germany will have the third highest amount with over 30 gigawatts. Aside from these three nations, operational capacity is forecast to increase around the world, and this will come from a mixture of incumbent and developing offshore wind markets. Now, if you focus on the right-hand chart, what we're showing here is basically countries around the world that have set 2030 offshore wind targets and our sort of likelihood view of them achieving these targets. Now, it's worth mentioning that mainland China is not included in this graph as they don't have a countrywide 2030 target. And this likelihood sort of percentage that we've given these different countries has been based on the current pipeline of projects that they have ongoing, as well as internal factors affecting the offshore wind sectors of each of those countries. So as we can see from the graphic, we see Germany is having the highest likelihood of reaching its target of 30 gigawatts of capacity by 2030. We view the UK as having an 85% chance of reaching its target, and the Netherlands and Poland have been given an 80% chance. The US, South Korea, and Japan have been given a 70-75% likelihood, and France has been given a 60% chance. And finally, on the lower end is Taiwan, which we currently view as having a 55% likelihood. Now, moving on to our floating wind outlook, Westwood has revised down its 2030 floating wind operational capacity forecast from 15.9 gigawatts, which was reported in our 1Q 2023 quarterly report, to 7.5 gigawatts. Now, we forecast that commercial scale projects will begin coming online towards the end of the decade, with most of the floating wind pipeline becoming operational from 2030 onwards. So on average, through our analysis, we see that an offshore wind farm can take between 7 to 10 years to become operational from the date it has been awarded the lease. So this has been one of the reasons for our downward revision. But other factors such as permitting and grid connection challenges, as well as floating wind specific requirements such as port infrastructure investment, O&M strategies, and the development of commercial scale floating technologies have also sort of been brought in for us revising down our floating wind forecast. Now, major revisions have occurred in countries such as Spain and Italy, for example. Spain is aiming to have 3 gigawatts of floating wind capacity by 2030. However, permitting procedures as well as an auction model have still yet to be fully established in that country. In Italy, currently, there's no sort of centralized system with regards to project approvals. They have to go through sort of different bodies to get approvals for different parts of your project. So that's one of the reasons why we've revised down our Italian forecast. And in the UK as well, forecast capacity has been reduced by over 1.4 gigawatts, as we now expect projects with a capacity of over 100 megawatts to come online by 2030, with larger scale UK projects coming online in the next decade. Now, looking at our leasing outlook, the global pipeline is set to continue to rise, and significant capacity is set to be awarded via lease auctions over the remainder of this year and over the next 2 years. Now, 2022 was a huge year for global offshore wind lease awards, and 2023 is expected to be slightly higher than 2022. A total of 32 gigawatts of lease capacity has already been awarded this year, and a further 24 gigawatts is scheduled to be awarded by the end of the year. Now, over 21 gigawatts is expected to be awarded in the APAC region by the end of 2023, with 90% of this capacity being attributed to lease areas located offshore mainland China. Over in the Americas, over 2.6 gigawatts is also anticipated to be awarded, and this capacity is attributed to the Oregon lease auction, which comprises of 2 floating wind sites. 2024 lease awards are currently expected to be lower than 2023, with over 49.1 gigawatts of leases forecast to be awarded, and 2025 is also expected to witness a further reduction with over 32.4 gigawatts anticipated to be awarded. Now, this might change as I believe our initial 2023 forecast was lower than this, but as new countries come, as they start establishing their auctions and auction processes, it is a possibility that 2024 or 2025 might actually grow as countries start developing their policies. Now, significant capacity is continuing to be awarded in both established and new markets, and this trend is set to continue. So over the next 2 years, European leases are expected to be awarded in established markets, such as the UK via the 4.5 gigawatt Celtic Sea floating wind auction, in the Netherlands via the IJmuiden Veer 1 and 4 sites, as well as in Belgium for sites located in the Princess Elizabeth zone. And also newer offshore wind market entrants such as Portugal and Lithuania are also expected to award leases in the period of 24 to 25. So in Portugal, it's 3.5 gigawatts of fixed and floating wind sites are expected to be awarded, and a 700 megawatt project site is scheduled to be awarded in Lithuania. Finally, looking at the APAC region, we also see leases being awarded in both established and new offshore wind markets over the next 2 years. So Taiwan's round 3 phase 2 auction is set for 2024, and phase 3 is expected to take place in 2025. So outside of Taiwan, leases are also expected to be awarded in newer markets such as India and Australia over the next 2 years. Moving on to our expenditure outlook across all regions, this graph uses a 3-year moving average, and we can see that Europe leads the pack. Europe is forecast to account for 50% of total global spend between 2023 and 2030, and this is driven by ambitious targets set by countries such as the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as our expected ramp-up of project activity in newer and emerging markets such as France and Poland. The rest of APAC region is expected to follow a similar trajectory to Europe, with expenditure gradually increasing through to 2030. Again, similar reasons to Europe, as there are, again, many countries that have ambitious targets in the rest of APAC region, key countries such as Taiwan, Vietnam, Japan, and South Korea will contribute to the pace of growth, and this is expected to pick up from 2027 onwards. The Americas is also ramping up its offshore wind development to 2030, with spend expected to increase from 2025 onwards. Due to the cancellation of PPAs that Peter has mentioned for several projects in the US, estimated FID dates have been pushed further to the right, and because of this, expenditure stays reasonably level until 2028, when its extent expected to sharply increase until the end of the decade, as the country aims to essentially meet its 2030 target. Now, cost inflation, again, as mentioned by Peter, is playing a role in the increase in spend for all 3 of these regions, something which hasn't affected the market in mainland China as much. So what's unique about mainland China is that spending started the decade with the highest amount out of all 4 regions in 2020, but began to change in around 21, 22 due to the low cost of Chinese turbines, which is a major component of overall project spend. So according to our calculations, Chinese turbine prices have fallen about 34% from 2020 to 2022 levels. So looking at it in this context, the cost inflation experienced in Europe and other regions, the situation in China has been the opposite. Now moving on to turbine OEMs. 3Q 2023 turbine capacity awards amounted to a total of 4.3 gigawatts. Now, orders for this quarter were dominated by Vestas, with more than 2.1 gigawatts of contract wins, mainly associated with the Herzig project in Germany and the Baltic Power wind farm in Poland. Overall, 3Q 2023 turbine capacity awards amounted to 19% of the forecasted 22.8 gigawatts, which are expected to be awarded for the full year. In the overall period of 2018 to 2023 year to date, so until the 3rd quarter, Siemens Gamesa continues to lead with a 25% market share, followed by Mingyang Smart Energy with a 14% market share, and Vestas has a 10% market share, sitting in 3rd place. Now, as we can see, Chinese OEMs do make up a large chunk of the global turbine awards. However, contract awards for these companies are mainly limited to the Chinese offshore wind market. Chinese OEMs have yet to fully penetrate the offshore wind market outside their home country. However, there have been calls quite recently from some parts of the industry, particularly within Europe, that projects should look to use these turbines to help reduce their capex costs. Now, although market penetration may occur by Chinese OEMs outside of China, we currently think it'll be unlikely for them to take over in terms of volume and capacity from non-Chinese OEMs, at least in the near term. Now, moving on to project certainty. So Westwood are launching a new layer of analysis to our WindLogix database called Project Certainty. This new module will allow users to be able to see the current likelihood each individual project has on reaching the final investment decision stage. So this will be available for all projects on which an FID has yet to be taken, and the projects are being scored on 10 criteria. So examples of some of these criteria include how much of the project's capacity is supported by a PPA or support mechanism, the overall project size and type of project, so if it's a fixed bottom project or a floating project, as well as what stage the lease of the project is at. Now, this is a very high level view that we're showing here in our graph. And it shows the current certainty status for projects which are expected to come online by 2030. So over 259 gigawatts of projects are forecast to come online between 2024 and 2030, with FIDs having been taken on 15% of this capacity already. A further 15% of projects have a probable status of reaching the FID stage. 52% have a status of possible, and 17% are currently risked. Now, as I mentioned, this is just a high-level view on the database. When this fully launches, each project will be scored on an individual basis, so you can look at every single project and see what its current score is based on those 10 criteria. And to find out more about this, please do get in touch with us to set up a demo of the database, and we can, go through it in more detail. Now, finally, moving on to new and emerging markets and who's investing, we can see that there's a diverse mix of companies that are currently involved in the development of offshore wind projects in these markets. So this map shows some of the top investors based on their capacity pipeline in each country, so their overall portfolio share of capacity. So the first thing to note is that some countries, the top investors are primarily local companies. So for example, Italy, Sweden, Japan, Poland, South Korea, if you look at the makeup of the top investors within those countries, they are primarily local companies within those countries. Now, in comparison to this, the top investors in countries such as the US and Taiwan are primarily international corporations. A final thing to highlight within the map is the countries in which corporations that are involved in the oil and gas sector are some of the top investors. So, for example, in South Korea, BP and Equinor are considered top investors based on their capacity portfolio, and both companies have shares in floating wind projects. In the US, Equinor and Total Energies are top investors. So Equinor has a mix of fixed and floating projects in its US portfolio, whilst Total Energies projects are all currently fixed bottom. And finally, in Brazil, we can see that Shell and Petrobras are amongst the top investors with regards to their capacity shares of projects. So to summarize what we've talked about today, challenges in the industry are becoming more pronounced, resulting in project cancellations or delays. Project financing is becoming a key concern, and some developers are changing their strategy from portfolio expansion to portfolio optimization. Now, despite these challenges, the industry remains cautiously enthusiastic about investment, even in new markets, albeit with a different mix of players. And finally, the role of government in ensuring that project developments move forward is increasing. In particular, difficulties arising from cost inflation will require greater governmental intervention. Now, that's the end of the presentation portion, and I believe we'll be moving on to the Q&A part of the session now.
Perfect. Thank you, Bahzard. Just while we transition into the Q&A, there is a poll that's come up on your screen. Please do take a moment to answer that. It would certainly be of help to us if we have any follow-ups from here. There we go. People slowly looking to answer. That's great news. Please do get involved and answer. At the same time, while you're doing that, please also have a think of any questions you've got for the audience. We have a few coming through. And thank you also for the good feedback. I see some good feedback coming through. Thank you, Henrik. But any questions you might have as well while people are answering that poll would be much appreciated. Just give it another minute to allow everyone the time. Right. Okay. Great. Well, let's crack on with some questions then. If everyone's got their cameras on, we are on. Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your great presentations. I certainly enjoyed it very much. So let's kick off maybe with just one for you, Bahzard. So, I know you briefly flashed up our project certainty assessment there, which is really an opportunity to highlight how we seeing essentially risk in the market, right? How are projects doing, how are they developing, and how risky does that kind of pipeline overall look? Considering that, and maybe with just a bit of background on the work we've been doing, what do you think is kind of one of the biggest risks that projects sort of in development are currently facing? And actually, we also have Jenna Sung as well asking, can you please explain the methodology a little bit more? What does risked project actually mean, etc.? So probably a bit of explanation on project certainty, and then just sort of answering, what do you think one of the biggest risks really are for projects in development?
Sure. So I'll start with, I guess, our methodology. So essentially, each project is scored on 10 different criteria. I mentioned some of them before. So where it is in the lease, has it got a lease or is it option agreement, for example? How much of the capacity is supported already? So, do they have PPAs for 50% or for 100%, or does it have a support mechanism, for example, a CFD for 100% of the project capacity? So each of those different criteria give the project an overall score. And then the overall score of the project gives it a status. So I believe if it's between 0 to 50% on that scoring, it's currently considered risk. If it's 50% to 74%, it's probable. If it's 75% plus, it's possible. If it's 50%, 75%, and then probable if it's 75% plus. So that's how we sort of give it overall status. In terms of, I guess, one of the biggest risks, I'd say, is financing. It's something that seems to be affecting the industry a lot at the moment. If we look, for example, as Peter mentioned, the Norfolk Briers project that had a CFD, it had its support mechanism in place. I think in our certainty score prior to cancellation have probably been quite high, because I think even other criteria such as contracts or turbines, I think, had been selected as well. A lot of work had gone into that project, so clearly there was a big financing issue, even though they had the support by the CFD. And another example is sort of the Northland Power have been working for quite a while, trying to reach an FID stage for their Hai project as well as their project in Poland. So that's just another example. Although they reached FID, it took, I'd say, longer than expected. So it seems to be costs, getting that financing, getting that sort of financial backing seems to currently be the big issue. Longer term, I'd say projects, within that pipeline that are more towards the 28, 29, 2030 online dates and beyond will be grid connections. Grid connection agreements getting put into place. So, a lot of countries, it's a big issue. Grid infrastructure to meet their targets just isn't there at the moment. So, making sure that there is enough areas for projects to plug into is going to be something that's going to affect sort of those longer term projects.
Yeah, and I guess there's quite a geographic spread as well, right? In the sense of depending on where you are, but there are consistent themes around finance, grid connections, and those sorts of things. And then you get to individual countries where you see certain issues arising. Perfect, thank you. And I think the project certainty side of things certainly was one of the things that we were very keen on helping people understand. It's one of the first times I think we're really seeing a consistent, transparent approach to assessing the market and where it's at from the demand side. So please do reach out if you've got any questions on that one in particular. And maybe one for both Peter and Baz as well. So Nicholas Rigby specifically asked around the likelihood of countries reaching their targets. So I have to put my hand up on behalf of and the team here just briefly, I think we got the percentages slightly wrong on the sides of the chart because it goes up to 40%. I think the top is meant to be 100%, not 40% in terms of the likelihood of achieving the target. Otherwise, everyone's going to miss their targets that we said. But as you said, Bahzard, it's Germany was at the highest level of that. But I guess what Nicholas is trying to ask the question on is what is the gap here between ambition, words, and targets, and being able to deliver on those in reality, especially as we think that there are gaps there. Is it real? Can we really see that these countries are going to hit their targets?
So I guess, as I mentioned, it's a mixture of things, that percentage likelihood. So first of all, is the pipeline. So what is in the current pipeline versus what is their target? So I think Germany pretty much is just slightly over 30 gigawatts, and their target is 30 gigawatts. And and then the other factor is the situation within the country. So Germany is a good example of why it's got a high likelihood, because the grid connection side of things is handled separately for the project. The central, I can't remember, but Peter might know the name, but the Central Energy Authority essentially, has put proper timelines in place as well for each individual project when it comes to the leasing side of things. So all of these leases that are coming, they have a set date for their lease auctions as well. So it's pretty well organized, and I think that grid connection aspect of it also does make a big difference. Having a separate entities like 50 Hertz or the different TSOs being in charge of that aspect of it definitely helped with Germany. Other countries, again, so as I mentioned, it's based on pipelines of projects. So the US, the current pipeline, I think, was around 26 gigawatts. So they'll have to sort of make up that remainder, first of all, of projects to hit the 30 gigawatt, and then the current issues that are, currently happening in the US as well. So that's sort of how we've come up with different likelihoods of the projects.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Nicholas, I mean, it's worth kind of, as Baz has said there, it is based on kind of what you can see and how likely that's to happen. But of course, as you're probably intimating as well, as you've also got to think about project certainty underneath all of that. So how likely is it that those projects will hit their target? And of course, somewhere like the UK, you would have expected them to be right on track. We recently put out an insight on this. But of course, some of the bidding in AR5 and the Vattenfall project specifically start to sort of question, even though it looks very strong, the pipeline, start to question even a very mature country being able to reach things. Now imagine you're, in a place where you don't have many of these things lined up and there are further headwinds to think about. Then it becomes even more of a problem. So the level of immaturity is really, I think, a big factor in all of this. And I know there's a question from David Foxwell as well. We'll come to that on the US in just a minute. But I think part of, if we think about project certainty, we think about countries, think about delivery, of course, sort of at the kind of, how do you say this, at the most advanced stage of offshore wind, it's kind of ability to really play a large part of the energy transition was about offshore wind playing a bigger role. It wasn't just about electrons, it's also about molecules, and therefore having a role to play from producing hydrogen and P2X specifically. Gunnar, I know that you and WFO specifically spend some time looking at offshore wind to hydrogen. Can you maybe just sort of highlight to the folks on the call around, so where is that going? How is offshore wind to hydrogen developing?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Very exciting topic. So indeed, we are kind of closely looking at how the offshore wind to hydrogen situation is developing, because many people around the world are actually very interested in that topic. And we feel it really does have a very bright future. It seems to be technology that can be very kind of nicely integrated into offshore wind. But I think we still have a few fundamental things to figure out first. So it's really important that we don't get kind of overexcited and want to kind of build large-scale installations already now. But I think people, agree that some fundamental questions do need to be answered first around how is green hydrogen being produced? Do we do it centrally, kind of within the offshore wind farm, or integrate electrolyzers into the turbines, or have them attached to every individual turbine? So still some really fundamental things to be figured out. Also in terms of regulation, very kind of completely new thing, how to regulate not just the electricity production, but potential green hydrogen production. How does the remuneration work? Kind of completely new mechanisms will have to be developed, but we already see some very promising regulatory steps being taken by certain countries, Germany, for example, but also the Netherlands, Denmark, and but also kind of overseas markets like Japan, Australia seem to be really interested in coupling offshore wind with hydrogen. And therefore, we really think it's a very exciting topic, but we really need to use the next couple of years to make sure we get the setup right, start with some demo projects to really make sure it works. And then we might be looking at larger scale installations for offshore wind to hydrogen, maybe towards 2030 or during the 2030s. But it's definitely something that is already of interest to everybody now, but we just need a bit of patience and kind of, brain power to make sure we get the fundamentals right first.
Just a quick follow-up question to that then, Gunnar. Do you think that, considering how the market's having to deal with the core offshore wind product itself, that hydrogen as a result shifts out a little bit, or is this still very much part of the plan?
Yeah, exactly. I would say it's still very much part of the plan, I think, because it can I think, help projects to become maybe even more economically viable. So I think thinking from a kind of comprehensive, integrated approach, it does help the industry, makes it more attractive, allows for kind of different options, can nicely be coupled with floating offshore wind as well. But it's not something for kind of near-term projects, which will be built over the next 3, 4, 5 years. But I think especially after 2030, kind of once we have more details around how to do offshore wind to hydrogen, once floating has really kind of gone large scale, then I think we're really looking at a fantastic array of options of how to build offshore wind, whether it's classical, standalone, bottom fixed, floating, or offshore wind to hydrogen, either with bottom fixed or floating. I think it really increases the options that countries around the world have, depending on their individual kind of requirements or geographical conditions, to really select the option that works best for them. So I think it's a great development for the industry, and will definitely help the industry, especially after 2030, I would say.
Perfect. Yes, hydrogen is still very much a part of the future. Thank you, Gunnar. Okay. So as I said, we'd come back to David, your question. Let me just read it out so everyone's fully aware of what it is. In your view, how do you think the situation with the US offshore wind projects will be resolved? If in fact we think it's a situation, but of course I think we do. But they get a better price or just rebid later? And what are the implications of these and other options? Big question. I think we've got that question a few times before, but it's a big question. Peter, can I hand it over to you to give David some thoughts on that one?
Yes, thanks, David. It's obviously a really tough one. I don't think we have too much clarity about what's going to happen at the moment. To me, it feels like there is something of a question of a policy choice to be made here. We've seen some of the developers, for example, talking about additional refinements to the IRA provisions that were put in place previously to try and unlock additional savings for offshore wind farms through there. But to me, it does really seem like there is a question of a policy choice for the states that are in question, because we know project developers will cancel their projects, even if they incur termination penalties of tens of millions of dollars. And one of the things that they've been saying essentially in those cancellations is, we prefer the terms that you've put in place for your later solicitations that have things like inflation indexation and so on. And so one of the things the New York project developers, for example, have essentially been saying is, if we agree these projects on the terms that you're now offering to new solicitations, we think they would have been valued at this level, which would be more viable. But I think it's a very difficult question. There are lots of complicated factors. For a state level, I think you ultimately have the policy question of, do you have a legally binding target to deliver offshore wind capacity? If so, is it incumbent upon you to deliver that capacity as fast as possible or as cheap as possible? It may be that delaying would just result in a higher price, in which case, surely it's a better thing just to accept a price hike from the developers, even though that's obviously a bitter pill to swallow. But I think we are seeing efforts as well to try and essentially find additional savings or additional revenue generation, which can go some way to offsetting these higher costs and the burden that those place on the consumer. So as I mentioned previously, things about additional refinements to the IRA to make more tax credits available to projects that maybe just aren't very conveniently situated to take advantage of them at the moment because of the level that they're in. All things like multi-state procurement approaches, which we've seen discussed recently. Maybe that will be able to produce something. So ultimately a very difficult question. I'm not sure I have any answers, but clearly we can see the threat of cancellation is real.
Yeah. I guess what's interesting about all of this is the political willingness to want offshore wind to happen at the end of the day, right? So in Europe, you see a very, very keen drive to make offshore wind happen. It's a large portion of the future electricity mix, certainly in Northern Europe. But it's a smaller player in many other parts of the world. And so the kind of willingness for governments to maybe play a part, compromise, and do their thing will certainly be interesting to see how that plays out. Certainly a change of government in the US may change the sentiment as well in that sense. Okay, so I think we are close to the end. We can still potentially ask a couple of questions. There is, I think, one from Demetrius, so let me just briefly deal with that one. From in the interest of time, Demetrius, happy to have a further chat afterwards. But I guess gas pricing, of course, gas is typically in sort of more, how do you say this, liberalized markets. It becomes the marginal price in a power market. And so therefore, the margin sets the price. And if your gas prices are rocketing as they have been recently and have been very volatile recently, whether you've got 1% of gas or 99% of gas, it sets your marginal price and therefore sets a very high power price. That essentially is the capture price for your offshore wind power as well. So it may very well, of course, impact the MPV, but of course it also depends on how the market is structured, and also whether you've got things like CFDs, etc., in place that essentially cap, if you put it in those words, the money that's going to come through the door. So there are a few different ways of looking at that. So it depends on the market. It depends how liberalized it is. And it also depends on where the gas price ultimately stands and how it's influencing things. Okay. Okay, we've got a couple more. Okay. Nicholas, thank you. What we might do is come back to you via email afterwards. I think that would merit maybe another response separately. I think as we are essentially at the end of time, I want to say thank you for everyone for your contributions and for listening in. We did have some really good questions and some good answers as well. Thank you very much to the panel. There are some other things coming out from WFO and from Westwood in the coming weeks that will hopefully complement and build on some of this. So Project Certainty is certainly one of those. I know selfishly also from the Westwood side, we're bringing out a new podcast series. We had one on offshore wind very recently, so Energy Transition Now it's called. Please do go and check that out on anywhere you get your podcast, but we've also got one coming out on hydrogen specifically, well, which is going to be very important for the offshore wind industry. The first one's with AP Ventures, really trying to understand why would you invest in hydrogen when it's such a nascent technology. So please do go and check that as well. But thank you again for everyone. Thank you to the panel, and thank you for your questions for everyone that's dialed in.